Welcome to Financial Inclusion Week. This is the 10th anniversary, and we're bringing together leaders from all over the world, entrepreneurs, investors, donors, regulators, and researchers to share what's working and what we need to do better. I'm Michael Schlein, I'm the CEO of Accion, and I am thrilled to be joined by Ajay Banga, the president of World Bank and a longtime champion of financial inclusion. Thank you and welcome back.
Thank you, Michael.
You were just a few months into the job. Now you're about 16 months. Love for you to just reflect on that time. What are the highlights? What are the low points? What are the challenges?
I mean, the biggest highlight is the privilege that it is to be able to do a job like this. I never thought I would have a chance to do it. And I remind myself of that each day when I walk into the office and remember that it's a chance and an opportunity to apply capital and knowledge at scale with a long-term point of view, all of which is relevant to our conversation on financial inclusion. So that's kind of the first privilege and the first part of it. Lots has happened, Michael. We've managed to speed up the project approval time. We started at 19 months from start to approval. We're down to 16, headed to 12. I'd like to get it lower, but 12 is a big change. We've worked much better with other multilateral development banks, and if you get a chance, I can give you examples of that. But also doing things with the private sector, because I believe that there's too much at stake here to think that we can solve these things, the various challenges, by just applying public capital or MDB capital. We need the private sector with its ability to reinvest and bring technology and innovation and its people, bring them to the party and make them focus on this. So much work going on there. A lot of work going on with stretching our balance sheet so we can be a more productive use of our capital that we get from taxpayers and sovereigns. And then the last little bit is all this translates into the ability to have bigger goals that can drive ambition and outcomes. So to give you an example, want to connect 300 million people in Africa to renewable energy by 2030. That's half the people who today don't have access to any power. I want to connect 1.5 billion people to primary health care, digital and physical, but to better outcomes to trap what I call the diseases of prosperity early in a diagnostic cycle. Heart attacks, blood pressure, diabetes, things that aren't getting adequate attention in the primary healthcare system. And then I want to, we've made a declaration about taking 45% of our financing out of IBRD and IDA and devoting it to climate, half adaptation, half mitigation, things like that. These are all fairly big goals to do in a short period of time. And I think they're enabled by the speed, the better partnerships, the private sector, all that. So it's kind of a nice mix of things.
That 45% goal is enormously ambitious, and you, right from the start, reframed the World Bank's vision saying you want to end poverty on a livable planet. That is an enormous cultural change. How is that going?
So the first thing we did was to recognize the intertwined nature of the challenges that we were facing. The idea that we could continue to focus on poverty and shared prosperity without finding a way to widen the aperture of our lens to include climate and fragility, conflict and violence and food insecurity and pandemics, it just didn't make sense any longer. We saw that when COVID happened, the progress we were making on poverty alleviation as a society, not just the bank, as a society, that kind of hit a wall and in a number of countries has gone backwards in these past 4 years, 5 years. So trying to deal with these in neat buckets is not a luxury that we can afford. So to get that into the bank's lexicon, the idea of adding livable planet came up. So you can choose what makes the planet less livable where you are. So a global idea adapted locally and allowing you to focus on the challenges of that country were very important. While doing that, we brought a focus on women and young people, and this connects back to our topic of inclusion. Women, because they're half the population, and they still don't get the opportunity to either be as productive a participant in the economy, or even more importantly, get a fair shake as part of society. And then young people, because 1.2 billion young people are coming through the pipe in the emerging markets over the next 12 to 15 years, ready for a job. They call that a demographic dividend. It is, if you give them clean air and clean water and health and education when they're growing up. And once they're grown up, you've got to give them a job. The same countries are currently on a pathway to generate 400 odd million jobs. It's a big gap. That gap is a gap that we have to change. Forecasts are not destiny. But to not allow them to become destiny, we got to work on it and give these people a chance for what a job does for them. Not just earning for them and their family, but as you and I both know, the sense of dignity, that they have a purpose and an optimism. Their optimism is our future. That's the demographic dividend. It's not the number of people, it's their optimism and energy. Question is, can we harness that the right way?
That job growth is so critically important. Are you seeing some countries, are there bright spots? Are there countries that are doing this well?
Yes, yes. I mean, look, if you go back in time, Michael, you look at the last 15, 20 years, and if you look through the unbelievable change in the attack on poverty that happened in China, in India, in Bangladesh, in Brazil, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, these were not accidental improvements. They were done through, of course, the right infrastructure of health, education, skilling, and the like, and the right physical infrastructure in these countries. But they were also done through a concerted effort to allow jobs to get created. In the case of China, by becoming the factory of the world. True for Indonesia and Bangladesh and Vietnam to an extent. In the case of India, by feeding the domestic consumption pattern of India and enabling businesses and enterprises to grow there, as well as growth in services, which India has done an amazing job of. Now, there's more challenges in all these countries, so much progress was made. Someone gave me a statistic the other day that close to 1 billion odd jobs were generated in the last 15, 20 years between these countries, but also the wider emerging markets as a whole. That would explain a great deal of the burst in prosperity or the reduction in poverty that we've seen over the last couple of decades. Question is, now what? What's next?
And that's a great question. We've seen over the last 10 years exclusion, 3 billion people being excluded, and now it's closer to 2. That is enormous, enormous
Financial
progress.
exclusion.
Financial exclusion. But the next billion is going to be harder than the last billion. They are smallholder farmers. They're in extremely rural areas. They're women. They're micro and small businesses. How do you see those challenges? And also, how do we maintain that momentum?
So I think that the challenge, actually, you're completely correct, that as we get closer to fewer and fewer numbers who have to be included, it's going to get harder and harder because they're dispersed. They are more disadvantaged than the others. But Michael, you know this really well. You've done this for years in Accion, and you understand the space. The starting point is that you have to give these people an identity of some type. Preferably a digital one, digitally verifiable, because that digitization is what cuts through the barriers of incumbency or the challenges of infrastructure. And so if you can give people a digital identity, which some countries have done well on, others are beginning to do, and the World Bank is working with 60 odd countries right now in the last 15, 20 months on trying to accelerate the process of issuing digital identities. Once you do that, you enable a bank to take the next step, whether it's a full bank or a non-bank financial institution or a payment bank or lighter regulated, but all of them need an identity of the individual to be able to open an account of some type. In the cloud, on the phone, with your fingertip, properly in a bank, whatever you consider to be the variant of an account, a repository of funds from which they can then spend, you need to have that identity. And then you need to open that account. Then that account needs to get used. Because if the account gets used, guess what it does? It builds a history. And that history enables you to extend credit and insurance. And that's financial inclusion. It's not just the identity. It's not just the opening of the bank account. It's not just its use. It's the using of that use data to create real financial inclusion that is the long-term play here. That thread, which runs through these, is to me very important. And that's what we have to remain focused on. That's why the bank's working on these 60 countries for identities. We're working with a number of countries on enabling social payment programs, which enables the account that's opened to receive money coming in and the person using it to spend. In the beginning, they'll just go and take out cash at an ATM. That's not helpful in building a history. But over time, with the right education and financial literacy, they'll begin to use it to transact and to save. And that's when the credit and insurance capabilities can kick in. Now, this is easier said than done. There's a lot involved in this. There's expense. There's regulatory changes required. There's a lot of things required. But the fact is, there is no shortcut to changing the lives of these 2 billion people, or 1.5 that people estimate are still outside the main system. And that's what I'm talking about. There's one other thing. Small businesses, one of their challenges is working capital and credit. One of the best ways you can zap that and get through it is to connect them to faster payment systems. You will reduce the cost of correspondent banking. You will reduce the time it takes for you to get paid as a vendor to somebody else. And all that is another thing we're working on, enabling 50 odd countries to look at the regulatory environment to connect fast payment systems, not just in the country, but also to friendly user countries and enable faster, quicker payments of bills and transmission of money.
You mentioned digital IDs and fast
Yeah.
payments, and there is a very exciting revolution in technology of digital public infrastructure.
Yes.
India, Brazil,
Yes.
many other countries.
Yes.
There's also some challenges and some things to be concerned about. You've spoken about technology can be game-changing if done well,
Yes.
and the question is, are we doing this well? Specifically around digital public infrastructure, there are real issues around privacy and governance and continued funding and continued innovation. I'd love to get your view, because this is, on the one hand, this is very exciting. On the other hand, there are challenges.
Indeed. So I think India was the one that really kicked off this conversation in a big way with what they call the India Stack, which essentially was DPI before it became known as DPI. And what it was, the brilliance of it was in its simplicity. You issued a digital identity to hundreds of millions of people through a decentralized program which allowed you to come to different centers and get yourself registered and receive that identity and a physical card with a number. And they took your biometrics as well. And then from there, you enabled the opening of bank accounts with that identity. And then you enabled the funding of those bank accounts through the social benefit schemes that the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi, was commencing with even greater vigor than in the past. And so you created a few of those steps that we were discussing earlier. And I think that simplicity was enhanced by then adding other parts of the DPI stack, which was document recognition and record. So I could record the documents with you, and then you could attest to them as the government that they were genuine. I didn't need a notary public. I could exchange the documents, and so on. The idea of creating many different buckets to that physical foundation. But on top of that, you need the private sector to build the apps. If the government starts to build the apps, the ability to keep pace with innovation and the change that is required, that gets impaired. Governments have many priorities. This is one of them. So I think the trick is create the foundation, allow the private sector to build on it. That's a great virtual combination that enables for the most multiplier effect to work. Some countries are doing that better than the others. Within that, there is the issue of governance and privacy. I think there can be no compromise on the privacy and security of a citizen's data, whether it is their identity, their biometrics, or also their purchasing pattern and their behavior. At the end of the day, all it will take is for this to be abused or misused, and we'll set back the opportunity to reach those 1.5 billion people because of a few mistakes done somewhere or the other. We have a chance to do this the right way. Technology today is capable of building through cryptograms and through the blockchain an even safer and even better method of governing and sharing this information. I think we should embrace it with all opportunities in it and keep going. The idea of DPI is here to stay. All we're talking about is tinkering at the edges to make it safer and better governance and doing the right thing with data and privacy, not the idea of not doing DPI. That, we shouldn't lose that.
Another technology that people are very excited about, generative AI. Do you think it's game-changing for financial inclusion? Are you seeing relevant applications, or is this still to come?
I think it's early days, Michael. I do think of it as game-changing, not just for financial inclusion, but all types of inclusion. I think it could transform the way we deliver healthcare, the way we deliver education, the way we educate farmers about climate and sustainability and drought-resistant seeds and heat-resistant, you know what I mean, the whole thing. Markets that they could access, fertilizer at a better price. There's so much that can be done for small farmers and micro enterprises and individuals with AI. I do think that the one thing that people should think about very carefully is that the things you need to really power AI onshore as compared to accessing it as a service from elsewhere is you need computing power, electricity, data, lots of it, kept in its simplest form, safe and private, and then the people who know how to massage that and create the algorithms to work with. The emerging markets don't have enough of those four things: computing power, electricity, data kept the right way, and people. Some countries do. India has an amazing capability, but not all emerging markets have that. I think finding a way for us, institutions like yours and mine, to enable emerging markets to take advantage of this technology and not get left behind will be very important. I recognize the transformative power of digital. That's why we've taken our knowledge bank and made a vertical, a fifth vertical there, which is digital. And it's focused on the power of digital to convert DPI, but also AI and data and its ethics and governance as part of being the transformation that's going to make a difference to prosperity and people and planet and infrastructure. That's how important I think this whole digital and AI revolution is capable of being.
We're seeing all around the world some sluggish economies, the debt crisis, governments are stretched thin, especially following the pandemic. We're seeing floods, droughts, increasing climate crisis. Are you worried? Is there stress in the emerging markets? And also, can inclusive finance play a role in building resilience?
Well, I think definitely there is stress in those markets. We've seen that if you look at a number of these countries who are currently spending more on repaying debt than they are on spending on health and education combined, then you know that this is a difficult place for them. There's a number of steps that people like us can take. The IMF has led, along with us, a global sovereign debt roundtable, which works with the G20 common framework to help countries reprofile that debt. That roundtable has everybody there: multilaterals, bilaterals, the Paris Club, the whole lot, commercial lenders. And so what we're trying to do for Chad, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Zambia that are going through this, we're the ones giving them, in the last 4 years, $16 billion, half grant, half deeply concessional, which is kind of their lifeline to keep their economies going. The real work, which is happening in all these four, is to reprofile that debt and get them to move on from there. Now, inclusive growth of all types is what is the final answer in these countries. And financial inclusion and inclusion in terms of literacy and the ability to use digital tools is kind of important, because it can help small and medium enterprises with managing their capital and their credit and their working capital. It can help small businesses and small farmers get access to seeds and fertilizer and climate challenges. I think this is the right space for us all to remain focused on. The important thing is that you look at our 300 million people we're connecting in Africa to power. If 600 million people in Africa don't have power, digitization is going to leave them out. Because you can't charge a phone relying on the sun unless you convert it. And so we need to get them power. Power is a human right, Michael. It's a human right. If we can connect 300 million people in partnership with the African Development Bank and Rockefeller and others by the end of 2030, then at least while doing that and installing distributed solar power stations, we're also installing cell phone towers with the cell phone companies. So I can get them to be digitally included while also included with electricity. And I think it's this kind of thinking of 1 + 1 = 3 that your organization plays a very key role in. Because financial inclusion is the ultimate multiplier. And that's what we've got to do.
You are speaking today to a very broad cross-section all around the world of the financial inclusion community. Any message to them, any area you want them to focus on?
Oh, absolutely. I think, remember, this is hard work, patient work, but very rewarding. It has that multiplier we just talked about. And so the multiplier is your North Star. And I think using digitization, using technology, using AI, but working in partnership with governments and banks and others who are willing to bring their shoulder to the wheel is the most important thing. The way we lose in the financial inclusion fight is if we try to do it individually. That's a hard battle to win. This is a very deep problem. It doesn't get solved with individual effort. It gets solved with all shoulders at the wheel, with partners at the table.
Last question, a personal question.
Yes.
What's the most fun part of the job?
Of the World Bank job?
Yeah.
The people. When you get to meet these people, You meet people who are not just subject matter experts because of their education or the years of working in, say, desalination or gender violence or infrastructure. It's not just that. They have lived and worked in so many countries around the world with their families. They move. And they actually live and work in places that most people go in the opposite direction from. That on the ground knowledge and that dedication, if you can harness that to its highest productive use, which is what we are trying to do at the bank, then I believe that this is a very, very, very powerful group of really exciting people whose motivation is worth watching. And that's the drive.
Ajay, thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you so much for your leadership. And thank you all for watching and participating in Financial Inclusion Week. We have much more to come. A lot of great speakers, a lot of great conversations. I hope you'll continue to join us. Thank you all very much.